Hola.
Buenas, ¿cómo estás?
Aquí, mija, ¿y tú?
Bien, almorzando. Por eso estoy apagada la cámara, porque estoy comiendo, mija.
Ay, ojalá que se me vea bien el pelo porque qué desastre. He estado recostada y corrigiendo como una máquina. Chungurin, 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 así. Tú sabes,
Ah, sí, sí.
forcing myself to read and read and read. I had to take a break because the grades were suffering.
Oh gosh. There's Dr. Benson. I just
Ay, ahí
text
está
reminding
el
everybody.
doctor.
Greetings, Dr. Benson. Welcome.
Good, almost
Doctor
there.
Scott. That's what they would call you in Puerto Rico, I'm sure. Scott.
It's good.
The first is you don't get it for a couple of years.
Well,
Yes.
sometime when the environment's more appropriate, I'll tell you because Benson sounds a lot like something else that begins with an M, and I always had to correct people. It's Benson, not something else.
I know, deja eso. I have a cousin that still says, ay Dios, I am starving. And so everybody says, instead of saying they're hungry or whatever, everybody, even the Anglo say, I am starving. Yeah. So Scott, how did you end up in Puerto Rico for that time? Can you tell us?
Yeah, so my PhD project was working for Union Carbide, cleaning up, looking at phytoremediation technologies to clean up their site outside of Ponce.
Mm.
So I lived between Ponce and then weekends in Dominican Republic visiting friends. But I was doing evaluations of different grasses in their removed tank farms to remediate polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons on the south coast there, just outside of Ponce.
Well, that was hard work, I'm sure, because well, there's still ongoing battles with that, with the remnants of things that people leave in Puerto Rico and they don't think that they have to clean.
Yeah, as soon as the tax breaks ended, Union Carbide pulled out and left, and they left a disaster.
I know it. I know it. So, but I know you weren't part of that. Hey, we have like 1 minute. Anyone wants to get more festive or something? I don't know. Maybe not. Let's just,
Looks good.
that's right.
Very festive.
It's our last of the training of this year. And welcome everyone. Welcome Kamailik. How are you?
Good. Good
Princess.
morning.
Hey. Eliane, what's up? Hey Jenny.
Good morning. No, good afternoon already, noon.
Yeah, ¿verdad? It's 12, so I guess we could claim it either way. So today we have a great presentation by someone that I consider a friend and ally in the Division of Public Health. And his name is Scott Benson. And there's a silent L at the beginning. What is that? What is your real name then?
Lowell Scott Benson.
Okay, so Scott Benson is good. I'm just teasing you. So because of all that we go through when we're in the field and we're anywhere and people ask us questions, even from our family, anybody, about this Omicron variant, the CHWs that work with us, they're just super duper. They read everything, etc. But it would be good, I felt, to have that connection with you as an infectious disease doc. That's his training, as well as public health. And that's a super good combination because it really frames what the work that you do, CHWs, and so with vaccines, what's to come, now we're still boosting people and vaccinating younger kids. When the pill comes, we'll have to deal with that. And So, I mean, all these things that it never stops for community workers. So Scott is familiar, right, with this work. So we find it to be the solution really to trying to get people motivated to do what's better for themselves without calling them stupid or not listening to what they have to say, even though sometimes you do want to call people, but we don't. We meet them where they are. And so if you can explain and give us a little presentation about the Omicron, the trends that you see coming, for infectious disease, and we'll go from there. Lots of questions from the ladies, and gentlemen, sorry. And so without further ado, I'm going to give you the floor, Scott. Can you share?
Yep, I am ready to go.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm guessing you can all see my screen.
Yes,
Fantastic. All right, so when Dr. Lopez asked me to take a few minutes, I thought, this is fantastic, a wonderful opportunity to help proselytize some of the truth that what we know and what we don't know about COVID and the things going on in the community, and to try to dispel some myths and get some information out there to counter the misinformation that's going on. So I appreciate this time. To start with, I just want to kind of reassure you that I'm not receiving any pharmaceutical industry support. My funding on research and active global health projects comes from Gates, NIH, and the CDC. So none of this is influenced by industry at all. I do want to put a disclaimer up front that I'm speaking on my own behalf as a clinician and as a public health professional, not on behalf of the university. But more importantly, as we've seen over the past 18 months, our understanding of COVID changes over time. And so what I will tell you is as recent as information that I was digging at last night. However, like the weather between July and December, it changes. And we have to recognize that as we learn more going forward, some of the things we talk about today may actually change and end up being incorrect in the future or very correct. But for today's date, I'll give you the most accurate I can moving forward. I want to start out really with some basics so that we're all speaking a common language. So when we talk about COVID, we're actually talking about a disease. The virus is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, as opposed to SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-MERS. The disease is COVID-19. So when we test people, we don't actually do COVID testing. We test them for the presence of the virus. We test them for SARS-CoV-2. We actually cannot test anyone for COVID. That's just laziness in language in saying that they got a COVID test. They actually got a test to detect the virus, or a SARS-CoV-2 test. And that really becomes important because you can have the virus present without having the disease present. And so testing positive for SARS-CoV-2, or in common language, having a positive COVID test, does not necessarily mean that you have the disease COVID. Okay? It's kind of like the actual organism that causes strep throat is group A strep, but the name of the disease caused by group A strep is strep throat. You get a strep throat test, but we're not testing to see if you have a throat. We're testing to see if you have group A strep. Same with HIV and AIDS. We test you for the virus HIV, and if you're positive for the virus, then you can develop the disease at some time of AIDS. So we are not using good language when we talk about COVID testing in the community. And that's a really important failure on kind of our part as a scientific community. The virus, the SARS-CoV-2, is an RNA virus. It's one of a number of hundreds of coronaviruses that infect camels, pigs, bats, and there are a few that infect humans. This is an electronic micrograph and a depiction of what the SARS-CoV-2, and when we talk about the spikes, it's those little red things there on the surface of that virus in the bottom. And it is spread by, through the nose, through the mouth. That's why masks work. And it's spread in close contact in your inhaled and exhaled saliva and mist. But it's also aerosolized in really fine droplets if it comes from deep down in your lungs. There's a difference between what comes out of here, your upper nose and throat. That's mostly big mucousy stuff. What comes out from below the throat, from the lungs, is the aerosol. So if you only have it up here, it's not going to spread very far. And that's why masks work. When it's down here, masks are less effective, though they still have some efficacy in reducing the spread of the virus. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Kind of the important thing to realize, and unfortunately, it's been a long time for some of us since high school biology, is that viruses really aren't alive. They're kind of these inanimate objects that in order for them to replicate and to propagate infections through communities, they actually have to hijack your cell. And so when a virus comes into contact with your mucous membrane, what it does is it finds the right receptors and it drills into your cell and it dumps its genetic material into your cell. And then your cell is what actually replicates and assembles the virus and spits it out to go infect somebody else. So unlike bacteria, where you can kill the bacteria so that it can't infect anyone else, you can't kill a virus because it's not alive. The only thing that you can do is stop it from hijacking your cell and replicating in your cell. And that's why antivirals and antibacterials are so different, because they really work through different mechanisms of action. The other thing that's particular about a virus is that often you get this low level of reproduction where it's hijacking your cells and only making a few copies. And these are the people that are asymptomatic, that don't even know that they're carrying it and spreading the virus. And we know that somewhere between 40 and 70% of people that actually acquire the SARS-CoV-2 virus will have it replicate and spread it without the demonstration of symptoms, which is different than some of our other coronaviruses. So that kind of complicates things. The way this happens, and there are a couple of important things that are key to what an infection occurring. If you look at this graph, you'll see that there's a virus sitting above those little blue Ys sticking out that are cellular receptors. When the virus receptors, spike proteins, find the right cellular receptors, they bind together, and that allows the virus to release its material into the cell. If those receptors aren't present on the cell, the virus can't get in. If the spike proteins aren't correct on the virus, it can't get in. So when those two match up correctly, you get infection. That's important because what we've learned is that the virus binds to what's called the ACE2 receptor. And these receptors are almost everywhere in our body. They're on what's called the endothelial lining, the lining of stuff. Initially, we thought SARS-CoV-2 was a pulmonary virus. In hindsight, what we're learning is that it goes everywhere, and that's why you get skin disease and brain disease and kidney disease. It's just that we saw it first in the lungs because there is so much vasculature in the lungs and so many ACE2 receptors that it goes there often. And a lot of receptors and a lot of binding and a lot of potential for disease. But it also means that that's not the only place it can go. The only places so far that we haven't found ACE2 receptors are in some of the gonadal tissue and maybe some old bony tissue. And we're still, there's some contradictory findings there, so we're not quite sure. But SARS as a virus can actually affect any tissue that has an endothelial lining, you know, like blood vessels going through it. That's why you see disease in all portions of the body. Where there are more vessels, you're going to see more disease. That's why we see more in the lungs and more in the brain, because that's where the blood vessels are. When you're exposed to the virus, look at this little black dot, the antigen. That's the virus. Your immune response, when it recognizes that antigen or that virus, it takes it up into an antigen presenting cell, an APC. And from there, it starts the immune response. And that immune response results in different forms of white cells, T helper cells, T killer cells, B cells, macrophages. All of those are different components of the immune response. Now, the B cells go on to form antibodies. So when we talk about measuring antibodies, we're only talking about measuring a very small portion of the immune system's response to that infection. So when we talk about an antibody response, they're present, they're absent, it's only a small window onto what's going on, and it does not represent the whole immune system. That's why it can be really complicated to say, well, I have antibodies, I'm immune. Not necessarily. The thing that a vaccine does is it takes the antigen out, it removes the actual virus, and you give a portion of the virus, like the shell. And your body reacts the exact same way, builds the same T cells, the same B cells, the same antigens and antibodies, excuse me, but without seeing the complete virus. That's how these vaccines work. We take a little bit of the virus, we expose it to your immune system responds as if it were the whole virus, and you build a response for the next time you see the virus. Vaccines are important for the next time that you see it. There's this common misperception out there that if you're vaccinated, you're never going to get sick. That's not true with any vaccine. What vaccines do, they don't create a magic bubble around you that prevents virus and bacteria from getting to you. They work after you're exposed a second time to that virus or bacteria. So when you're vaccinated, you've been exposed to the virus. When you're unvaccinated, you're exposed to the virus. When you're vaccinated, because you've had that exposure already, your immune system is already trained to respond, so it responds within hours. Whereas if you're unvaccinated and you haven't seen that organism before, it's going to take days to build that response. If you're vaccinated, because you have systemic immunity, when that virus lands on your mucous membranes, the excuse me, the immediate replication for those hours that it's taking for your body to respond is generally limited to that area of the mucous membranes. In an unvaccinated person, because they have no systemic immunity, it gets to the mucous membranes and then it spreads systemically. In an individual that's vaccinated, they have that transient replication on the mucous membranes for a few hours, as opposed to days for the individual that's unvaccinated. When I spoke earlier about the difference in the virus between here and here, when the virus is replicating and is spread from here, it's in your mucus, it's in your big drops of water. So a mask stops it. When it's spread from down here in an unvaccinated person, it's aerosolized and it's harder to stop. Masks work okay, but not as well as they do in a vaccinated individual. So a vaccinated individual may test positive for a few hours, maybe a day, but an unvaccinated person will test positive for days because of the replication of the virus in your cells in those areas where that doesn't happen with an unvaccinated person. It replicates for a couple of hours, your immune system responds, stops the replication, gets rid of the virus, and you're good. So a vaccinated person can test positive for a brief window, and they can spread it for a brief limited amount of time, but nothing compared to an unvaccinated person. They will test positive for days and have the potential to spread the virus for days. So that becomes really important, and I'll show you a graphic about that in a minute. One of the big questions that kind of came up about vaccination is this 3 to 4 week versus the 6-month interval. And a lot of the data about the third dose and boosters comes from looking at this data of how and what happened between these countries. If you look at the United States, Israel, and Qatar, we held very closely to the recommendations of Pfizer and Moderna of giving people doses at 3 and 4 weeks. The UK and Canada, on the other hand, chose to vaccinate as many of the population as they could, and then come back later with the second dose. So it ended up being 3-4 months later. What we observed in the different batches is this. If you look at this, what happens is the round dots are the alpha, the the red triangles are delta. You see that in Qatar, Israel, and the United States, alpha, we had really good immunity to alpha across the board. But when delta came along, our immunity dropped. But in the countries where they spaced out the vaccines, there was almost no diminution in the difference between the alpha or undifferentiated initial COVID and the delta variant. And that kind of led us to believe that maybe there was some important information on this spacing of doses, and that the third dose coming at a 6-month interval would provide an increase in your immune response, a broader immune response to include more variants, and a deeper immune response, meaning that it was a more long-lasting response than just the 2-dose series. And when we look at almost all other childhood vaccines, they are spaced at least 6 months to a year out, and we see and recognize that. Again, it was probably a little bit of a miscommunication to imply that there would only be 2 doses or 1 dose of the Johnson & Johnson, when in the back of our minds, we knew that there would need to be probably a 3rd dose out in the future, because it's not until about 6 months that you cause immunity to become more focused in the bone marrow and more permanent than just at 3 and 6 weeks. So here again, we didn't message that well. We really probably knew that there would be a 3rd dose necessary, but we did not do that well. So jumping a little bit from Delta to now Omicron, it's really interesting that Delta, the Delta had a number of mutations. If you compare Delta to the original SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-2 would transmit from 1 person to about 1.5 people. For every infection, there was about 1.5 new infections. Delta represented a change with 18 new mutations in the spike proteins, those little red dots. And it increased transmission from 1.5 to about 6 people. So Delta was much more infectious between people and more severe disease. Omicron is still new enough that we're not sure about some of these numbers. But what we do recognize is that where the original didn't have mutations because it was the original, Delta had about 18 mutations in the spike. Omicron has 43 mutations. 26 of them are completely unique. And they're in important areas that change how the virus binds to cells, how it's released from cells, and if antibodies can recognize Omicron as a SARS-CoV-2 virus. What it appears to be, right now, the initial data coming out of both the labs in South Africa seems to suggest that Omicron may be about twice as infectious as Delta. However, individuals who contract the Omicron variant now don't seem to get as sick and don't seem to remain hospitalized for as long. What we will have yet to see is if so many more people get infected, we still may see hospitals overwhelmed and an increase of deaths just due to the sheer number of infections if Omicron truly is twice as infectious as is Delta. It's just a matter of numbers. If you look, this is Utah. If you look at the gray starting on the left side of the screen, that's the original alpha, the original variant of SARS-CoV-2. Then you start seeing this blue creep in. That's beta. Then you see this huge wave of kind of orange. That's the Delta wave. That's what happened with Delta. Now we have, as far as I know, 2 reported cases of Omicron in Utah. So if Omicron is twice as infectious as Delta, we may actually see a more dramatic increase, but hopefully a more dramatic decrease as well. And the question is it true that Omicron variant is close to the common cold? Kind of. So the Omicron variant has a genetic portion of the common cold virus within its genetic strand. However, so that implies that someone at some time had both COVID, the Omicron variant, and a common cold virus. However, the genetic portion of the common cold virus that is integrated into the Omicron variant is not in an external binding site. So it's not that they're related, it's that somebody had them at the same time. There was a little genetic swapping of material like teenagers do. And so it has some of its genetic material, but it's not on the surface where it can influence the behavior of Omicron, to the best of our knowledge. So with Omicron coming, this is what we know. What we know that people who are what we call fully vaccinated, 1 dose of Johnson & Johnson or 2 doses of the mRNAs, they experience a diminution of their effectiveness from about 95 to about, or excuse me, from 90% to about 85%. So there's a 50% reduction in the efficacy of the virus, of the vaccine. We see fewer in vaccinated compared to unvaccinated. The vaccine still provides over 80% effectiveness in reducing hospitalizations and deaths. In individuals that have received either 3 doses of the mRNAs or the Johnson & Johnson plus a boosted dose, we see significantly enhanced protection. It's maintaining in the 90% efficacy. We're seeing fewer individuals that test positive for Omicron in those individuals that have the 3 doses. We are seeing fewer hospitalizations and few deaths. Now, we're still early on, so we'll have to see how this all plays out. But it appears that yes, there's a little bit of diminution in the effectiveness of the vaccines if you've been fully vaccinated with the 1 or 2 doses. But if you've been vaccinated and boosted with the 2nd or 3rd dose, it appears that the diminishment of the effectiveness is very small. And though it remains very effective broadly for multiple variants of COVID. Now, I promised this graph a few minutes ago. This is what I was talking about if you compare a vaccinated individual versus an unvaccinated individual. So an unvaccinated individual that's exposed to this Omicron, they may have days of illness. And those days of illness, they're contagious. And they can test positive for days, and they may feel poorly for days. The vaccinated individual, they have this brief window when they're going to test positive. They have a brief window when it's replicating and they can shed it to somebody else. It's mostly confined to the upper airway, and so a mask is very effective at stopping the spread. The unvaccinated, when it gets down into their lungs and systemically, is when it aerosolizes and it's harder to trap and spread. This is how all vaccines work. The measles vaccine doesn't keep measles away from your house. It works the next time you're exposed to measles. So in order for vaccine to work, you almost have to be exposed a second time. But this is why we know we see people with breakthrough tests positive. It's to be expected. It doesn't mean that they are ill. It doesn't mean that the vaccine has failed. It just means that we're testing them in this very fine window when there is a day or two of replication. And imagine somebody walking through the public square that's infectious for 10 days and how many people they're going to expose versus the individual that's infectious for maybe 2 days. That's one of the ways that the vaccines significantly reduce the spread of disease in communities. The most recent recommendations for the different vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, it's approved for kids aged 5 to 11, and then existing approval for 12 and up. So really anyone over 5 can get the Pfizer vaccine. The Moderna vaccine is only approved for individuals 18 years of age and older, and the Johnson & Johnson for 18 years of age and older. There is a difference between a booster dose and a 3rd dose. A 3rd dose is for an individual who has a compromised immune system, and they receive a 3rd dose at the same strength as the first 2 doses of the vaccine of the same product, generally Pfizer or Moderna. A booster, which was approved yesterday for 16 and 17-year-olds with Pfizer, and it's still not approved with Moderna, 18 and up only with Moderna. A booster for those of us with a competent immune system is a reduced dose of the 1st and 2nd doses of the vaccine. So you're being exposed to less of the mRNA on the 3rd dose if it's a booster, because you have a functioning immune system that can recognize it and remember your first 2 vaccinations. That 3rd dose really enhances the immune response, and we know that. It just wasn't well communicated. In kids 5 to 12, the pediatric dose of the Pfizer vaccine, it's a smaller dose than what adults receive. 86% of kids report a sore arm where the vaccine was given. Duh. I mean, if somebody sticks a needle in your arm, it's going to hurt. But in the study, there were no adverse events seen in the kids. It's greater than 91% effective in kids in preventing serious disease, hospitalization, and there were no deaths in the kids that received the Pfizer vaccine prior to its approval. So I know that people have questions about the risks of vaccines, but I'd like to just take a moment and put it in perspective. If you look at the background risks of blood clots and myocarditis, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this in more detail, There is a background level, and it's really small. And when you're vaccinated, there is a slight increase in risk for myocarditis and blood clots. Absolutely. And I'll give you those numbers here in a minute. But the risk of myocarditis and blood clots from the disease COVID is about 8,000 times that of background disease. So you might double your risk by getting the vaccine. But that's nothing compared to the 8,000-fold increase in risk from disease itself, from getting COVID. So we say that the virus is safe. It is safe. It is effective. There's a small increase of risk. But again, the benefit of not taking on the 8,000 to 10,000-fold risk with COVID is absolutely worth it. There are a few myths out there. The vaccine was tested. It's actually one of our most tested and proven vaccines that we have out there. The magic, and you got to give, I don't care what your political persuasion is, you have to give Trump some credit for enabling an environment where these vaccines could be manufactured quickly. Usually what we do when we test vaccines is we enroll a few thousand people for a couple of months. We test them. Then we enroll, when their 2 months are up, we enroll another 1,000 people. And we do that for multiple years until we get tens of thousands of patients through the system. The way the funding was set up as far as this Operation Warp Speed, instead of 1 or 2 test centers, we had thousands of test centers enrolling hundreds of individuals that allowed us to get tens of thousands of people years of data within a few months' time. So instead of doing a few people over long periods of time, we did a lot of people in a short period of time. So we actually have more data than with other vaccines. Other people have looked at VAERS and said, well, more than 6,000 people have died from the vaccine. It's false. That is a misinterpretation of the terms, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The vaccines don't contain microchips. If you know how big a microchip is and how big the needle is, there's no way that can happen. Vaccines do not cause you to be magnetic. They do not cause infertility. In fact, if you're a pregnant woman or thinking of getting pregnant and get COVID, you may actually jeopardize your life or the life of the unborn child. So it's actually safer to get vaccinated if you're pregnant or thinking of getting pregnant than avoiding it. These vaccines do not change your DNA. They are mRNA, not DNA. They affect the virus, not you. And it will not cause you to test positive for the virus. This is kind of the pattern of disease that we see. It kind of comes in waves. We have the initial alpha, and then the beta, and then the delta, and now we're entering Omicron. And I anticipate that this is what we're going to kind of see going forward, is we're going to see some waves. Hopefully they start to get not quite as high and a little bit broader until we reach kind of what's going to be a new background of normal. And we'll probably not, I'm going to say get rid of it completely. This will probably be with us for a long time, but it will get to a low level so that it is not the social problem that it is. Question from Kathy, is myocarditis reversible? That's a great question, and I will get to that here in a minute when I talk about myocarditis, because there's some brand new data that just came out this week that we'll get to. So hold on to that thought. It's a great thought. And Yenny, yes, the Pfizer vaccine is approved for 3rd dose now, or boosters for 16 and 17-year-olds. That happened yesterday.
Yes. Excited.
Now, if you look at COVID in Utah by race and ethnicity, and how you want to look at the categories is, I don't necessarily think this is the best breakdown, but here at the blue line is kind of the majority of Utah population, this white, non-Hispanic, like anybody's really white alone. the population of Utah is about 78%, but only 68% of people that test positive are this white group. If you look at American Indian, Alaska Native, non-Hispanic, Hispanic Latino, Native American, they have an increased rate of testing positive. They also have an increased rate of hospitalization. And 2 of those groups have a significantly increased rate of death. Now, it's interesting that we're not seeing that in other populations, but this is that social determinant racial bias that we're seeing in the data, and there are probably some genetic non-racial factors that play into this that we are not good at serving some of these communities with effective information pre-COVID with respect to diabetes, obesity, hypertension, which are risk factors for high mortality related to COVID. And so there are probably some genetic non-racial contributors that are in populations that are making this testing, hospitalization, and mortality unbalanced. And I presume that there are also, just based on discussions, trust that we don't have in the medical community good trust with some of our non-white populations. And that's unfortunate because this is largely preventable if we communicate it better and more effectively. So what are some of the treatments? There's remdesivir, which was approved, which is an antiviral, which we've had for a long time. It stops the virus from being able to hijack part of your cellular machinery. It works pretty good. It's not great. It can only be taken after you've already got exposure and disease. There are monoclonal antibody treatments. There was just one approved, this AstraZeneca Evusheld, which can actually be given to somebody who doesn't have an immune system or a very good immune system as kind of a preventive instead of a vaccine, because they may not respond to a vaccine. This was just approved for very specific populations for whom vaccines won't work. It does not replace the vaccine in immunocompetent individuals. It replaces the vaccine in individuals with a compromised immune system. The rest of the multiple monoclonal antibodies that are approved, you actually have to have disease first before the monoclonal antibody can work, because otherwise it's just floating around waiting for something to happen, and it doesn't do anything until the virus is there for it to fight against. Now, there are 2 agents out there. One is called munipavir, which is named for Thor's hammer, which is produced by Merck, and it just went through FDA. The preliminary committee voted 13-10 to approve it. It reduces hospitalization and death by about 30%. The problem, though, is, and my infectious disease boss here at the university spoke out about this in an article, is that it's actually a mutagen. What it does is it causes a mutation in the RNA of the virus so that it doesn't replicate. There are some, and I think reasonably concerned, that mutation that is prompted by the antiviral, we don't know if human DNA is completely resistant or maybe susceptible to that mutagenesis. So I'm a little bit reluctant to get on the molnupiravir bandwagon yet. Pfizer, though, is coming out with, and we're just waiting for it to go through the FDA evaluation, a medication called Paxlovid. And Paxlovid is a protease inhibitor with another agent called ritonavir. We've used protease inhibitors in HIV for 25 years. We've used ritonavir in combination with our HIV meds for 25 years. We know how these work, and they work really well at preventing that. If you remember how the virus gets into your cell and then gets out, it blocks that pathway. And the ritonavir is a medication that makes it so your body holds the Paxlovid for a long time. Just hold on to it, don't let the kidneys get rid of it, so that it circulates, and it, instead of having to take a pill every 2 hours, you can take it once, twice a day. And it reduces the virus's ability to replicate. And it has been shown in preliminary data to reduce severe disease, hospitalization, and death by 89% using technologies that we're very familiar with. So I'm actually really excited for Paxlovid, for it to be evaluated and released. And I think that that's really going to be one of the key turning points. But again, it really doesn't work until after you've been exposed to the virus. Now, I'll put on my tinfoil hat here for a minute, because one of the biggest challenges that we've faced with COVID-19 is misinformation. And part of that is because we haven't known and we're learning as we go, there's a lot of area that we don't have answers to yet, and that has been filled in with misinformation. There was a really interesting study that was done in 2018 prior to COVID. And they went back and they looked at the Twitter bots and Russian trolls that amplified political messages in the 2016 election between Trump and Clinton. Those same Twitter bots and troll sites were still active in 2018, but they were propagating 2/3 anti-vaccine information and 1/3 pro-vaccine information. Now, why would the Russians be interested in causing us to be contentious and not believe our government officials about vaccines? What's just so contention and distrust of our institutions? And it's working. I mean, we are paying so much attention fighting each other that we're not looking at the rest of the world. We're not paying attention to the other problems that's going on in Ukraine, the challenges with China, the challenges with refugees right now, with our border. There are so many other things we could worry about if we just all agreed that vaccines save lives. Not perfect, but they save lives. Now, a lot of people will cite this VAERS, and most of you are probably familiar with VAERS. VAERS is a CDC and FDA program that if anyone is vaccinated, if there is any adverse effect, you can submit that to VAERS. The CDC will then evaluate and call you and track it down to determine if it's a legitimate concern. And if it is, then they'll try to track down and see if it's related to the vaccine or not. Now, people cite this VAERS database, and you have to understand that anybody could submit anything. So people have actually submitted that after the vaccine, their baby turned into Wonder Woman, or that they grew green big muscles and turned into the Hulk, just to prove that anything could be submitted. We have asked people to be extra aggressive in sending information in with respect to COVID, because we want to know if there are adverse vaccine reactions. But as y'all know, correlation is not causation. And right now, a lot of the information in the vaccine database is correlation, not causation. And it's going to be a few years before, if we see anything that might be considered causal. And if you look at that, if people are saying, people told me, look, 9,000 people have died because of the COVID vaccine. Well, let's do some math. The United States population in 2020 was over 331 million people. The death rate prior to the pandemic, just from all-cause mortality, was 7.15 people per 100,000. So in 2020, we expect 2.3 million deaths from all causes in the United States. As of the first of this month, we had over 201 million people vaccinated. So if you take the number of vaccinated individuals and compare it to the number of deaths that you would expect, we should actually see, and timestamp it from the beginning of the year to December 1st, we should actually see that 1,300,000 people who have been vaccinated should have died. Yet they're claiming that 9,000 died. So if anything, the vaccine is really, really protective. Okay, so this is nonsense, the way that people are extrapolating improper numbers from the VAERS database and trying to prove something that just isn't true. Yes, Dr. You can have Dr. Lopez, you can have the PowerPoints, no questions. Now, there are some legitimate controversies that I want to quickly go over. Thrombosis, myocarditis, and this local case of a teenager. Just for those that don't speak medical, a thrombosis is a blood clot. It's when platelets and red cells link up with the fibrin mesh and usually stop the flow of blood. If you're bleeding out, that's a good thing. If it happens inside the vessels, it's a bad thing. There are some risk factors that everybody has outside of COVID that put you at risk for thrombosis. Immobility, a long plane ride, pregnancy, unfortunately being female, being on birth control, genetics, obesity, all of these put you at an increased risk for a blood clot. If you look at the Johnson & Johnson data, as of a couple of weeks ago, there had been 54 verified cases of blood clots in 16 million doses of vaccine administered. That's approximately 3 blood clots per million doses. If you look at the baseline in the USA, there are about 1,000 blood clots per million people. So the thrombosis risk doesn't even approach our baseline risk of thrombosis in the United States. However, if you get COVID, your risk of thrombosis is about 21%, which means that in Utah, there are probably about 5,000 cases of COVID-related blood clots. So 54 across the nation from a vaccine is nothing compared to 5,000 from the disease. Myocarditis, question came up earlier. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart. If you look at Wikipedia, because it knows all. Oh wait, it's not an authoritative source. So if we look at the Mayo Clinic that says exactly the same thing as Wikipedia, it's an inflammation of the heart muscle, often caused by viruses. Myocarditis is rare. And after COVID-19 vaccination, it is also rare. As of a couple months ago, we had just over 1,000 cases of reports. Most of them were people who had received mRNA vaccines, mostly in men. And of those 1,300, 778 were confirmed. The CDC continues to investigate this. But again, let's look at the baseline. The baseline, there are a few thousand cases in kids every year. And the CDC hasn't given us the most recent number, so I had to look to Israel for their numbers. This is after the first dose, there were very few. After the second dose, there were more. After the third dose, half as many as the second dose experienced this myocarditis. So the myocarditis link after vaccine is about 0.05. At baseline, it's 0.003. The risk from the disease is about 15%. So yeah, there's a 10-fold risk with the vaccine, but there's a 10, 100, 1,000, there's a 2,000-fold risk of myocarditis with the disease. So do you want a 10-fold risk or a 2,000-fold risk of myocarditis? And myocarditis from the vaccine is rapidly reversible and mild and resolves within 48 hours. Myocarditis from the disease can be permanent and severe resulting in cardiac abnormalities for years. So a transient myocarditis that resolves quickly, or a prolonged, potentially lethal myocarditis that goes on for years. I think the vaccine wins in that case. There was, and I'm not giving away anything HIPAA, this is all taken out of the public domain from local news, everything. There was a 17-year-old young man who was a basketball player at a local high school. The day after his COVID vaccine, he had a headache, sore throat, swollen lymph nodes. We know that swollen lymph nodes is a common effect of the vaccine. It's because your immune response is ramping up in those lymph nodes. He was being treated for suppurative lymphadenitis, which means the lymph nodes are swollen. Often it's related to a bacterial infection. Well, he felt ill, but not bad enough that he didn't play in a basketball game. And when he was in the basketball game, he got hit in the neck with the elbow of an opposing player. Now, outside of COVID vaccination, trauma to the neck in the area of the lymph nodes is a known risk for blood clots in the brain and stroke. He then had increasing headaches, was hospitalized, and they found blood clots in his brain. Now, the young man fully recovered. His family is fully vaccinated. His father was hospitalized weeks later for blood clots. So there may be some unknown thing in the family that we didn't know. So the vaccine may have contributed, may have helped set up the environment in which blood clots could happen, but they did not directly cause his blood clots. So what is the risk for blood clots? It depends on your age, your vaccine status, your health and pre-existing condition, your personal hygiene habits, and your exposure to crowds. All of these, I guess it's your risk for disease, not clots. If you look at Utah, these are our numbers. This is the unvaccinated in orange, the vaccinated in blue. The unvaccinated are 2.5 times more likely to test positive for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. They are 5.6 times, the unvaccinated are 5.6 times more likely to be hospitalized. The unvaccinated are almost 7 times more likely to die from COVID vaccine. The vaccines are working. So someone with factor V clotting conditions still get vaccinated. So that's a great conversation to have with your doc, with your primary doc who knows your condition better. So far, the evidence would be yes. What we would recommend is to not be vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine. But if you're vaccinated with one of the mRNA vaccines, we have not seen that same pattern of clotting and that increased risk of clots with the mRNA vaccines. So someone with a factor V clotting condition can absolutely, with consultation in their primary provider, be vaccinated with one of the mRNA vaccines. Great question. So what does my crystal ball say going forward? Well, unfortunately, it's a little bit broken. I suspect we're actually going to see Omicron rise a bit through the winter, and we're going to be in full hospitals, full ICUs for the next couple of months, because it's going to be winter. We're going to be gathering as families and friends, and we're going to have kids in school. I would guess that if you receive the Johnson & Johnson, you're going to be encouraged to get a second and third dose from an mRNA vaccine, and that eventually is going to be expanded access to kids, adults, everybody. We are coming to the conclusion that mixing and matching appears to be okay, that if you got the Johnson & Johnson, getting the mRNA is probably a good thing. And if you look at all of our other vaccines, they're multiple doses. And so it really shouldn't surprise us that the COVID vaccine is going to be at least 3 doses, because all of them are. So what does this mean? You're smart people. No single strategy for almost anything is a complete strategy. Multiple things require multiple interventions. Complex systems require multiple interventions. COVID is no different. In order for us to get through and overcome this COVID, we need the combination of vaccinations, therapeutics, which are coming online, masking to reduce the spread, social distancing to reduce the spread, and then just social responsibility of not going to work, not gathering with others when you're sick. If we do those things like the layers of an onion, we can overcome this stupid COVID pandemic. How can you help? Get vaccinated. It protects you, protects your family and friends, protects your coworkers, and it protects the communities in which we reside and in which we live. So thank you for giving me some of your time. Stay safe, stay healthy, wear a mask. I'm happy to answer any questions. Vaccines cause adults. And with that, y'all know me. There's my email. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time. Dr. Lopez, I yield the floor back to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really am grateful that you were able to take the time to come to this, to this meeting at noon. I know that it's not the most, I mean, it's a Friday, what can I say? And it's approaching the holidays, so double thanks really to you. But I wanna open the floor to my colleagues here. Any questions you guys have? I don't see any raised hands because I don't have the. Feel free, because this is an expert, you guys. Any questions you hear in the community? Oh, here, Kamali, did you raise your hand or are you clapping? I'm not sure.
I know I clicked the wrong button. I am raising my
Okay.
hand. Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Dr. Benson, the monoclonal antibodies, they're only available for certain populations. Are we going to expand that to young children at all? I know that it's not going to be it's not a typical therapy for young children, but are there any conditions that it would be appropriate?
So kids that are hospitalized with severe disease can receive monoclonal antibodies in the supervision of hospitalization. On an outpatient basis, it's not yet approved for kids. And I don't know that that monoclonal antibodies are going to come along for kids, because the risk benefit is the possibility of an infusion reaction in a kid who has low risk of severe disease. The risk of infusion reaction may be greater than the benefit from monoclonal antibody in a kid that's at low risk for severe disease and death. That's why the kids that are already in the hospital at risk for severe disease and death get monoclonal antibodies, where ones in the communities are less likely at this point to be eligible for those monoclonal antibodies. But that's a great question. And as we know more, and as we get different varieties of monoclonal antibodies, that may change in the next 4 months.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that information.
Make sure you keep the information for Dr. Benson. Oh, Jenny, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. So recently I encountered a community member who told me, oh, this is a big pharmaceutical. I was at Rancho Market doing the outreach. And this person told me, oh, this is a big push for the pharmaceutical companies. Vaccines don't work. The best way to overcome this COVID is getting all of us infected, and it's not working. You still see people in the ICU unit. And he even told me that because the vaccine, his sister-in-law awake different disease that she was having just because of the vaccine. I know there are different questions to be answered, but what would be the best way to, answer with empathy and also understanding to a community member that is all against the vaccine?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the first thing is exactly what you did. It's listening, and listening to their concerns, and then finding out if they're open to resolving those concerns. Because if they are in a mindset that they don't really want to hear, then all of the evidence in the world that you could provide isn't going to convince them if they're not willing to change. But the few things that you could, pharmaceutical companies, some are going to make some money off this. That's no question about that. We live in a capitalist society. That's the way things happen. However, they are the argument the vaccines don't work. You just look at the numbers of the risk of hospitalization and death for the people that are vaccinated versus unvaccinated. It's a 7-fold increase in unvaccinated deaths in Utah. The vaccines work. As far as some of the other questions, let's see, what else? What were some of the other kind of things that they were asking? Pharmaceutical companies making money. Yeah, they're going to make some money. That's what the government paid them to do. They made it. They're going to make some money. It also allows them to do research into other therapeutics to stop the disease. I don't have a tie-in to pharmaceutical company, but what was some of the other concerns they had?
Like if the vaccines awake other disease that a person might have. Like if there is data or cases that, okay, if you have any, disease that is, that you don't know and the doctors don't discover, and with the vaccine, it's gonna awake those diseases. I've been hearing that the last 2 months. Vaccine gives me this tumor. I didn't have this, and now I have a tumor. I think the vaccine awake that. I didn't have that. Otherwise, it wouldn't.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and unfortunately, again, causation and correlation. Vaccines don't work that way. Vaccines stimulate the immune system, and that's it. And so vaccines don't provoke tumorigenesis and other diseases. They stimulate the immune system, and that's it. The other is kind of fanciful thinking. So I asked somebody that was in a car accident if they ate a tomato the day before. They said yes. The tomato didn't cause the car accident. They just happened to eat it before the car accident. Let's see. The other part of your question was vaccines and, getting the disease, natural immunity. So we don't know a lot about natural immunity, but what we do know is that people that were exposed to the initial alpha variant have a less robust response to the Delta and Omicron because they were only exposed to a non-mutated virus. The people that received the vaccines, because it stimulates the immune system more broadly, more deeply than does an alpha infection, it's more protective and it provides protection against a greater range of variants than does natural immunity. And because I can control how much vaccine you're exposed to, or how much virus you're exposed to in the vaccine, it's standardized. We can tell within reason how long that immunity is going to last, where we can't do that with a natural infection of COVID-19. So someone who's naturally infected, one person may have 18 months of immunity, someone else may have 3. With the vaccine, we can almost universally state that the vaccine works for at least 8 months, and with the booster, probably at least another 3 years, because it's standardized. Natural immunity is not standardized. And so, yes, it gives some transient immunity for a few weeks, but we can't predict how long that immunity is going to last after that.
So this just hurry up and get sick and then you're immune. It's not founded on any kind of
if you got because like measles doesn't mutate that fast. So if you got measles 20 years ago and were exposed to measles today, you're probably immune. But with all of these different variants that come out, if you got the original alpha COVID, and then you were exposed to Omicron, there's a significant risk that you might fall ill again because you didn't develop the right form of antibodies against the now variant strain of the Omicron virus, Omicron. So, this one, we're still in the really newborn ages of this virus, and it's still evolving and hasn't hit a stable mutation rate yet.
Kamali, you still have a question, hon?
No, I was clapping. Sorry. before.
Oh, okay, okay.
Let me
No,
see.
no,
Oh,
seriously.
let me lower my hand. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Thank
That's
you.
okay. I never know. So thank you. Oh, so Jenny is clapping for you. I am too, Dr. Benson. Thank you so much. You don't mind being taped, I'm hoping, because we're gonna share this with some folks who are in meetings and they just could not get away. And I hate for them to miss, this information. You are a doctor through and through, and so some of those, when you put them up, we're like, yikes. But because you're so good at explaining it too, in a way that we can then now, speak to others about this. It's so helpful. And so I don't know if my colleagues, I would hope that you can come back and,
Well,
and do this.
As you all know, the key to getting us through this is effective communication. And if we don't know how to talk to each other about these complex matters, we're not going to get anywhere. And we need to speak a common language in getting this communicated.
Totally. Any other questions that you want to jab him with before we let him go?
I just have a comment.
Go ahead, Ed.
And I just talked to Fahina Pasi from the National Tongan American Society, and I shared that statement about the high rate of deaths amongst Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. And she did say that they're just having a hard time getting people to get vaccinated. So, that's something that they're going to try and work harder at with their community. Yeah, it's hard to understand, but yes. So I just thought I'd mention that. Thank you.
Oh, that's a great point, and I think it comes down to this: we have a significant population, but we have not done well at reaching out and building cross-cultural ties to many of our communities here in the Salt Lake Valley. We're nice, but we're not always as friendly as we should be.
Thank you for the presentation, by the way.
And I'm happy to make the PowerPoints available. Dr.
Thank
Lopez,
you.
I'll send them to you as soon as we're done here.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Well, if there's no other questions, I'm just gonna thank you again for attending, and thank you, Dr. Benson, and trust that you'll be back. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.